In 1944, in the skies over England and France, German Focke-Wulf 189 reconnaissance planes, nicknamed the Frame, were on a desperate hunt for information. They sought the answer to a single, crucial question, on which the fate of the Third Reich depended. Where and when would the Allies strike? Where would the invasion of Europe, which everyone awaited with bated breath, begin? And what they saw in their aerial photographs both confirmed their worst fears and utterly misled them. In the fields of southeastern England, opposite the narrowest point of the English Channel, the Pas-de-Calais, they saw something monumental. Entire armies poised to strike. Hundreds, thousands of Sherman tanks and artillery pieces arranged in perfect columns. Vast encampments capable of housing hundreds of thousands of soldiers, newly built pipelines and port facilities. Everything indicated that it was here, at Pas-de-Calais, that the steel fist of the invasion was being forged. And at the head of this mighty army stood the most formidable and famous American general, George S. Patton. The German High Command was certain they had deciphered the Allied plan. They concentrated their best Panzer divisions near Pas-de-Calais, elite units ready to hurl the invaders back into the sea. But there was one thing they didn't know. This entire armada was a deception, the greatest hoax in the history of warfare. The tanks were made of rubber, inflatable like children's toys. The planes were made of wood and canvas, and the army of thousands was the product of the imagination of brilliant deceivers. This was the work of the strangest and most secret unit in the U.S. Army, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. This was an army whose weapons were not bullets and shells, but paint, loudspeakers, plywood, and theatrical skill. An army of artists, designers, sound engineers, and actors that managed to outwit the entire German intelligence apparatus and played what was arguably a decisive role in the success of the Normandy landings. To understand how this audacious idea was born, one must realize that the Second World War was not only a war of engines, but also a war of wits, a war of deception. Both sides actively used trickery and cunning to mislead their opponents. The British were true masters of this art. Their famous Operation Mint, where a corpse carrying fake documents was planted off the coast of Spain to convince the Germans the invasion would be in Greece, not Sicily, became a classic of espionage. As D-Day approached, the task of deceiving Hitler became paramount. The Allies understood that keeping preparations for such a massive invasion secret was impossible. You can't hide millions of soldiers and thousands of ships, but you can make the enemy believe the main blow will fall elsewhere. The perfect location for such disinformation was the Pas-de-Calais region. It was the most logical place for an invasion, the shortest distance across the Channel, the most suitable beaches, and the quickest route to Germany's industrial heartland. The Germans were convinced the Allies would strike there, and the Allies decided to play into this assumption, turning the Germans' expectation into their greatest vulnerability. Thus, Operation Fortitude was born, a complex, multi-layered deception campaign aimed at pinning Germany's best divisions to the Pas-de-Calais, while the real invasion began hundreds of miles to the west, in Normandy. Operation Fortitude had many components: the use of double agents feeding disinformation to the Germans, fake radio traffic, and diversionary bombing raids. But its most spectacular and creative component was to be the creation of an entire phantom army, an army that could be seen and heard. And this is where the Ghost Army entered the stage. The idea for such a unit came from several American officers inspired by the British experience with camouflage and deception in North Africa. They realized that modern warfare required not just brute force, but a subtle, artistic approach. In early 1944, recruitment for the new 23rd Unit began in top secret. But they weren't recruiting ordinary soldiers. They sought out the most talented and creative minds from across America. Artists from Walt Disney and Warner Brothers Studios, designers from Broadway, architects, radio sound engineers, advertising men, and actors. Among them were future celebrities like fashion designer Bill Blass, artist Ellsworth Kelly, and photographer Art Kane. These men, accustomed to paintbrushes and easels, were handed rifles, but their greatest weapons would be their talents. Their mission was stated simply: to impersonate U.S. Army units to deceive the enemy. The unit consisted of three main parts, each responsible for its own aspect of the grand deception. The first was the visual component, the 603rd Camouflage Engineer Battalion. Their job was to create the visual illusion of military hardware. They approached this with incredible ingenuity, creating a whole collection of inflatable mock-ups of military equipment. Sherman tanks, artillery pieces, jeeps, trucks all made of rubber. They could be transported on a few trucks, inflated with compressors in minutes. And from a reconnaissance pilot's perspective, a German scout would see an entire tank column. These mock-ups were astonishingly realistic. They weighed only about 90 pounds, so if soldiers could easily lift a tank and move it to a new location, creating the illusion of movement. To make the deception even more convincing, they mixed real equipment with the fakes. They even created fake tank tracks by rolling special implements over the ground. The second part was the sonic team, from the 313th Signal Company Special. Their task was to create the soundscape of a large army. Sound engineers from Hollywood, best studios recorded the sounds of everything that moved and fired in the army onto magnetic tape. The clatter of tank treads, the roar of engines, officers' commands, soldiers' chatter, the sounds of pontoon bridge construction. These recordings were mixed into entire sonic symphonies, then broadcast through massive speakers mounted on These sound trucks could create the illusion of an entire armored division on the move, with the sound audible up to 15 miles away. At night they would drive near the front lines and play their recordings, making the Germans believe that reinforcements were arriving or an attack was imminent. It was a true psychological war, where sound was as much a weapon as a shell. The third, and no less important, part was radio deception. A special signal unit mimicked the radio traffic of non-existent military formations. Radio operators, many of them actors, performed entire scripts over the airwaves. They mimicked the unique sending styles and habits of different radio operators, creating the complete illusion of a real division's headquarters at work. They transmitted fake orders reports, and even chatted casually about the weather or girls to make everything seem as realistic as possible. German radio intercept services listened intently to this traffic and reported to their command on the movements of armies that didn't actually exist. All three components, visual, sonic, and radio deception, worked together like a well-rehearsed orchestra, conducted by the Allied command. They could make the Germans believe an entire division had left one sector and appeared in another, compelling them to shift their reserves and leave crucial sectors of the front exposed. They were magicians, the illusionists of war, and their greatest performance was yet to come. The Ghost Army's masterpiece was its role in Operation Fortitude South. It was here, in the spring of 1944, that they created their most magnificent illusion. The first U.S. Army group, or FUSAG. This army existed only on paper and in the imaginations of the deceivers. But to German intelligence, it was more than real. The ghosts unleashed their activities across southeastern England, day and night. They inflated their rubber tanks, arranged plywood aircraft on dummy airfields, and built phony oil depots and piers. To make the illusion complete, they also employed elements of acting. Soldiers from the Ghost Army sewed the insignia of FUSAG's non-existent divisions onto their uniforms. They frequented local pubs, loudly discussing their battle plans and complaining about their imminent deployment across the Potomac. They even hired local women to do laundry, creating the impression of a massive troop buildup. The sonic teams worked tirelessly. At night, the clatter of treads and roar of engines echoed from the woods and fields, simulating the nocturnal marshes of armored columns. And FUSAG's radio operators maintained a high volume of traffic, which the Germans carefully intercepted. To lead this non-existent army, the Allies appointed a real and very high-profile figure, General George S. Patton. Patton, after the infamous soldier-slapping incident, had been temporarily removed from field command, but the Germans considered him their best, most aggressive, and most successful American general. They were certain he would be the one entrusted to lead the main invasion. The Allies brilliantly exploited this reputation. Patton actively commanded his Ghost Army, touring southeastern England, inspecting inflatable tanks, and giving speeches that they knew would be picked up by German intelligence. The deception worked perfectly. Hitler and his generals were utterly convinced that FUSAG was. On June 6, 1944, as real troops were storming the beaches of Normandy, the Ghost Army did not rest. On the contrary, their work became even more critical. Their task now was to hold German reserves at Pas-de-Calais for as long as possible. They had to convince the Germans that the Normandy landing was just a prelude, and that the main blow was still to come. The Ghost Army's radio operators began transmitting a flurry of messages, simulating FUSAG's preparations for an immediate invasion. Sonic teams created the illusion of troops boarding landing craft in the ports of southeastern England. Visual teams moved their inflatable armies even closer to the coast, and the Germans boarded. Even weeks after the D-Day landings, when the Allies had firmly established a beat, Hitler kept his powerful 15th Army waiting at Pas-de-Calais, awaiting Patton's strike. He was waiting for an army that didn't exist. This delay gave the Allies precious time to pour reinforcements into Normandy and expand the beat. Historians still debate the exact scale of the Ghost Army's contribution to this success, but most agree that it was colossal. It's possible that these inflatable tanks and fake radio messages saved the Normandy landings from disaster, but the Ghost's work didn't end in England. Once the Pas-de-Calais deception was no longer needed, the unit was secretly transferred to France. Now their mission was tactical deception on the battlefield itself, and here, their skills truly shone. They conducted dozens of operations, which they called performances. Here is one example. September 1944, the Battle for Brest. American forces are assaulting the heavily fortified port city. The Ghost Army is tasked with creating the illusion that another American division has arrived at this sector of the front, to make the German garrison believe they are overwhelmingly outnumbered and persuade them to surrender. At night, a small group of ghosts in a few jeeps and trucks arrives at a vacant section of the front line. They set up their massive speakers and begin broadcasting the sounds of an entire armored column arriving. Then they play recordings of soldiers setting up camp. In the morning, they inflate several dozen rubber tanks and artillery pieces, a few real soldiers, sew the patches of the non-existent division onto their uniforms and head into the nearest village to be accidentally spotted by local villagers, among whom they knew were German informants. The radio team begins transmitting intense traffic on behalf of the new division's headquarters. German intelligence reports to their command. Fresh forces have arrived to reinforce the Americans. The German garrison, already demoralized, surrenders. The largest of these was Operation Versen in March 1945, during the crossing of the Rhine River. The Ghost Army had to draw German attention away from the 9th U.S. Army's actual crossing point. They simulated preparations for a river crossing at a different location, 10 miles to the south. They deployed over 600 inflatable tanks, artillery pieces, and trucks. At night, their sonic teams broadcast the sounds of pontoon bridges being built. By day, smoke generators concealed the lack of any real activity. German artillery unleashed a furious artillery barrage on the rubber tanks and non-existent bridges, wasting thousands of precious shells. Meanwhile, 10 miles to the north, the real 9th Army crossed the Rhine with minimal resistance. But don't think that service in the Ghost Army was a safe pastime. These soldiers were not just artists and actors. They were on the front lines. For their deception to work, they often had to operate right under the enemy's nose. They drove their sound trucks too within a few hundred yards of German positions. They set up their inflatable tanks in open fields, risking artillery fire, and they suffered casualties. During their time in combat, 3 soldiers of the Ghost Army were killed and dozens were wounded. It was a small price compared to the losses in regular units, but it proves their work was deadly serious. They fought the enemy with their wits, creativity, and courage. They were masters of illusion, but the risk they faced was all too real. And all this time, their very existence was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Their operations were classified for 50 years. When the soldiers returned home, they couldn't even tell their wives and children what they had really done in the war. Their service records listed them as having served in ordinary engineering or signal corps units. The world knew nothing about them. They were true ghosts, whose deeds vanished into the fog of secrecy. The culmination of the Ghost Army's activities, and perhaps the most vivid testament to their skill, was their final major operation on the Western Front. After the successful Rhine crossing, as Allied forces pushed deep into Germany, a dangerous situation arose. An American infantry division met fierce resistance and was forced to pull back, leaving a dangerous gap several miles wide in the front line. There were no reserves to plug the hole. All available units were committed to the offensive, and so the Ghost Army was thrown into the breach. Just 800 men were tasked with impersonating an entire division of 15,000 to 20,000 soldiers and holding that section of the front. This was no longer just deception to divert the enemy. It was a pure bluff, a high-stakes gamble on the front line. Day and night, they moved their few real tanks and trucks from place to place to create the appearance of activity. Their sonic teams worked at full blast, broadcasting the sounds of equipment repair one moment and arriving columns the next. Radio operators mimicked the traffic of a headquarters and dozens of subordinate units, and small patrols of actors deliberately made themselves seen in different locations to give the Germans the impression that the entire area was densely occupied by American troops. For an entire week, these 800 men held the line against 2 German divisions, which never dared to attack, convinced they were facing a superior force. It was the pinnacle of their craft. They weren't just deceiving the enemy from a distance. They were looking the enemy in the eye and forcing them to believe an illusion, risking their lives every minute. When real reinforcements finally arrived, the ghosts vanished as quietly and discreetly as they had appeared, leaving only bewilderment in the enemy's ranks. After the war in Europe ended, the Ghost Army was disbanded as quietly and inconspicuously as it had been created. Its soldiers returned to civilian life. The artists went back to their easels, the designers to Broadway, the sound engineers to their studios. They brought home not only combat decorations, but also the heavy burden of a sworn oath of secrecy. For nearly half a century, their story remained unknown. They couldn't speak of their exploits or share their memories. Their contribution to victory was erased from the official histories. It was only in 1996, after the relevant documents were declared, that the world finally learned of the Ghost Army's existence. For many of the unit's veterans, it was a belated but long-awaited recognition. They could finally tell their children and grandchildren that their grandfather had been an engineer in the war. He had been part of the most creative and unusual army in history. Books, documentaries, and exhibitions of their work began to appear. In 2022, after long efforts by historians and veterans' families, the Ghost Army received the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor in the United States. Justice, though long delayed, had finally prevailed. So, what is the legacy of these warriors? It is immense and more relevant than ever. The Ghost Army pioneered what is now called information warfare or hybrid warfare. They proved that the perception of reality on the battlefield is as important as reality itself. They showed that you can defeat an enemy not by physically destroying them, but by manipulating their consciousness. forcing them to make fatal decisions. Today's technology has taken these ideas to a whole new level. Inflatable tanks have been replaced by digital phantoms and holograms. Instead of sound trucks, electronic warfare systems can create entire squadrons of non-existent aircraft on enemy radar. And instead of fake radio traffic, there are cyber attacks and social media disinformation campaigns. But the essence, the very philosophy of deception established by the Ghost Army, remains unchanged. Their experiences are studied in military academies around the world. They are the godfathers of modern psychological operations units, and their ultimate lesson is that the most powerful weapon isn't the one that makes the loudest bang, but the one that makes the enemy shoot at nothing. They proved that creativity, imagination, and artistry can be tools of war just as effective as steel and gunpowder. The story of the Ghost Army is a testament to unconventional thinking. It is a reminder that even in the darkest and most brutal of circumstances, such as war, there is always room for creativity and wit. And when we look at the old, faded photographs of rubber tanks and soldiers sewing on fake patches, we shouldn't see a mere curiosity of military history. We should see an army that, through its artistry, saved thousands of lives and helped win a war, all while remaining invisible to the enemy. They were true ghosts whose only shots were fired into the enemy's imagination. Your support is incredibly important to us. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to hit the notification bell, so you'll always stay up to date and never miss our new videos.